Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Experts webinar series. This is Microsoft Groups Demystified, 5 Keys to Successful Group Management. We're thrilled to have Microsoft MVP and Office 365 expert Joel Olson joining us today for an enlightening discussion along with our hybrid expert and Chaosoft founder Bob Boble on Microsoft Group Management.
And welcome. This is Joel Olson, and we're talking about Microsoft Groups Demystified. You know, I've been working with groups for, man, I feel old, about 20 plus years, and groups is actually something that I've struggled with, just wrestled with over time, and so I feel like I've got a lot of personal connection to this topic. And this infographic that we put together with Chaosoft really helps us wrap our arms around these 5 keys to successful group management. I'm really hopeful that this is going to be a topic that can help people to be able to really get their arms around things. Now, before we get started, let me introduce myself. I'm Joel Olson. I'm an MVP and regional director, and I'm a director at Perficient. In fact, I've got a bit of a history with Microsoft. I spent about 10 years there. 7 of those were across Microsoft IT and the SharePoint product marketing teams. As well, I spent some time at Slate.com, early Microsoft time as a contractor. And then later I came back as a Quest, as a partner working in Building 25. So spent a lot of time around Microsoft, and since then I spent a lot of time with the community, the Microsoft 365 community, and it's great to be here with all of you. And I also want to introduce Bob Boble, who's with us as well from Chaosoft, the sponsors of this webinar.
Hey, Joel. Thanks for helping us with this. Pretty big topic. And from what I saw in the preview, I think you gave it a really good treatment. Pretty excited to have this as one of those things that we sponsored. Thanks for doing it.
Hey, thanks a lot. So I absolutely want to start diving into this topic as well. And, you know, this is really a challenge. How do we get our arms around this? You know, on-prem groups, even in the last few companies I've been in, there's people who just wrestle with groups, the security groups, the distribution groups, the mailboxes, and now you've got these groups in the cloud which look like the future of groups. But what are we doing with all this legacy, and how do you manage this in a hybrid way? So I think that there's been this just exponential growth, especially with self-service in a lot of these companies where, hey, groups are self-service by default in a lot of organizations, and there's just years and years of unmanaged groups. And you think about that as well, the transparency or lack of visibility and managing these hybrid groups. There's no one tool that essentially Microsoft has provided to manage groups in a holistic way. And this group sprawl absolutely is leaving organizations vulnerable. And I don't mean to beat up Microsoft, because you know they say, hey, we've provided you PowerShell and Graph, anything you want to be able to do with these groups. And some of the latest features are fantastic. I love the new usage-based lifecycle features where if we're still using this, it's going to auto-extend it for us. That way the things that are not being used can actually be archived. And that ability to quickly archive and recover groups is another feature I just love. And the ability to kind of manage these and have better ownership. The tools that are in the cloud with Microsoft 365 have been getting better and better. And salute to Microsoft with the security aspects of this as well. When you start talking about features like if I log in 2 different places, there's the impossible travel aspects. So the cloud app security, there's a number of things that really have made this more secure. But let's just say there's a lot of legacy baggage and it keeps getting kicked down the road. And the truth is, there are more groups than IT has resources to keep up. And whether it's compliance that drives you or vulnerabilities and security and cybersecurity that drives you, one way or another, we really need to see how can we conquer this problem? How do we at least get our arms around it so that it doesn't even get, kicked back and forth between, is it security's problem? Is it compliance? Is it the SharePoint team, the Teams team? Whose problem is this, and how do we actually get our arms around it and understand it? I put together this infographic sponsored by Chaosoft. I think this is actually kind of a clever way of being able to do this. I actually did rely on a number of different Microsoft white papers and articles, put my head down and trying to figure out how do we really understand what successful group management should look like. I also took advantage of a number of conversations with Bob and team to really understand what does successful group management look like. And we came up with these 5 areas. First, you're going to define, and then plan and provision, audit, and archive. Now, we're over the next 45, 50 minutes you have with us, we're going to dive into each of these 5 areas to help you really start to wrap your head around successful group management and what that feels like. And at the end, Chaosoft has a really cool demo that Bob's going to be providing to us around what third-party tools look like in terms of being able to help get our arms around groups as well in this successful hybrid group management strategy. So these 5 things, let's take the first one, which is define. Define hybrid management group strategy for on-premises security groups and Microsoft 365 groups with classification. So before we get started, even when you start thinking about it, let's define what groups are. So first off, there's the Microsoft 365 groups, which if you've been doing much with Microsoft's Office 365 / Microsoft 365 environments, you'll notice that those are the ones where you've got kind of collaboration, both with users inside your company and outside your company, which give you access to Teams and SharePoint and Planner, Power BI, on and on, a number of services. So it basically allows you and a group of people to work across different services in Microsoft 365. It also is email enabled. Essentially, it is the security you're looking for inside of the cloud. So that way you're sharing within your group. It has good ownership. There's a number of reasons why Microsoft is kind of saying, hey, this is our way forward. Let's manage everything with the Microsoft 365 group. Then we've got these legacy group types. And when I say legacy, not all of them are going away. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I think that we have different ways of managing them. Security groups are these uber groups that essentially have been the way that we manage our resources on premise for the last number of decades. Security groups has been around as long as Active Directory has been around, but even early domains and things like that, we actually had security groups. Even remember the domain local groups and the global groups, universal groups, as well as even server local groups. We have all these different security groups that we needed to manage. And I'll tell you, IT management, this has been, it's that albatross around your neck, trying to manage resources. And that has gotten better and better over time, but it seems like it just never got to the level where it needs to be. And then we've got these distribution groups. We call them DLs, we call them DGs, but essentially these are email-enabled groups. So they're not the mail-enabled groups. These are just the DLs where it's kind of like a contact object where you can send to it and then it sends to other people. So it's used for email alerts or notifying a group of people. The problem with these kinds of groups is there's no history. Somebody comes in new to the company, you add them to the DL or the distribution group, and they have no history. They don't know what was sent prior. So there's this weird thing of every individual user has their copy of what was been sent to that. A lot of people set up rules, but one of my preferences for the Microsoft 365 groups is you get to go in there and you can actually see what the group has received. In the past, when I was at Microsoft, we would use public folders to be a member of a distribution group, so you then also have the history. So there's some reasons why one group over another, obviously. And then the last one is these mail-enabled security groups. And essentially, you can use them for security and you can use them for email. And I think in different places, this list gets simplified, but this is kind of a quick list of different types of groups. On the other side of this, we start to understand that these groups act as a single identity across Microsoft resources. They can be used for security perimeter, especially with the new features that just came with Teams, where you can actually say, hey, this group of people can't talk to this other group of people, as an example. They're also used for access control. So like, say, in SharePoint, this folder or file is restricted to these set of users. And there's a number of services that basically take advantage of that, where, like, say, a Yammer group, only the people who are members of that group can get into that Yammer group, and it'll take advantage of that group's functionality to do that. Same idea across plans and streams and forms and so on. It basically leverages the security that those groups provide. And on-premise, obviously, that's when you start thinking about file shares or SharePoint or even third-party tools. You leverage those security groups to provide a group of membership with access control. We call those permissions. Often they are accompanied with ACLs, the access control list that determines who can access a certain item. And on the last thing, we're talking about the admin UI. So the admin UI, especially in Office 365, we have the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you've got the Azure AD Admin Center, the Exchange Admin Center, and that's not to say as well, on-premise, you've also got Exchange and Active Directory, and there's obviously the different kind of column snap-ins, but essentially management interfaces for being able to manage the administration of groups through either PowerShell, using Graph, which you can actually kind of use those two together, but also the interfaces, maybe whether they're web-based or not. There's a couple things I borrowed from Microsoft IT. I think they're a great case study as it comes to, they eat their own dog food, so they understand what they can do with Microsoft, the Microsoft tools, and they also have their own set of goals because they obviously have to worry a lot about security and cybersecurity running such a large organization. So it's very easy to kind of pick at them and say, hey, how are you doing group management? How are you managing security with 100,000 plus users? And so a couple of things I'm just going to point out here. Empowerment is one of their values. This idea of, we want to make it easy for our users to do self-service creation. They want to leverage the lifecycle management features, and it's a lot around let's not let IT get in the way of Microsoft being able to get its work done. So they're big on self-service. And then there's the identifying valuable content, and I think this is important for any organization. Absolutely, you need to understand where the sensitive data is. In a lot of companies, the sensitive data might be somewhere else, but as you bring it in, as you start to trust Microsoft 365, or especially when you have sensitive mailboxes or sensitive groups that have access to sensitive data, how do you keep track of that stuff and keeping track of the membership for auditing that over time, as an example? There's features like DLP, the data loss prevention features, where you can say, hey, we're going to identify where there's PII, so security numbers, driver's license numbers, things like that might be stored throughout our environment, so we can quickly identify where that valuable content is, and we need to use classification. And we'll talk more about classification in a minute. But it is on top of that, now that we know where that sensitive data is, how do we actually protect that? Whether it's encryption or there's policies we want to enforce on top of it, conditional access, things like those CAS policies where we say, hey, people in China who are logging in can't do administration on this particular system, or you need to be a domain admin. Hey, in order to be able to do domain admin things, you need to be on site. I think that's one policy they may have actually tweaked during this COVID times, but it's that kind of thing where it's saying, hey, you need to be in this IP range to be able to manage these assets. So that way, if an account even gets hacked, you're using conditional access to enforce additional rules to keep things safe. And then there's the rights protection as well, where it's like can't print or can't share. Microsoft uses those a lot, where it's like, hey, this is employees only, and then keeps it from going beyond the boundaries that they provide. And I understand there's some usability there, but if you train your employees properly, that IP protection and policies can really go a long way. And especially when you combine that with your security strategy with groups. So like having an FTE group as a dynamic group is a huge bonus. It's a great best practice so that when you're trying to set up policies, they can leverage those groups. Even your guests, wouldn't it be great to be able to have a policy of all of the people who are outside of your organization and being able to enforce policies? Another great dynamic group to have. Now this last one, ensuring accountability. So when you start talking about reviewing membership, managing ownership, leveraging IT for the right things, because there absolutely is accountability. When you start saying who owns this data and who owns the rights and permissions, a lot of organizations say, oh, that's IT, they manage permissions. Well, we've already agreed that there's way more groups than IT can manage. So if that being the case, where does the data stewardship land? It lands on the owners. So if we have groups that the owners expire and there is no ownership, it's a huge problem. Now, I'm going to speed up a little bit, but I want to talk about classification. You need to know where is your confidential data, where is the data you're not worried about, you actually want to support it being more public, and understanding you may have 4 classifications, you may have 3 classifications, you may say everything is general, but then there's some sensitive data. So it's not that these are the labels for your organization, but absolutely, in order to gain trust with your users, you need to be able to start saying, we do classify our data. Instead of it being a system-wide classification, where can I put PII data? If I'm a recruiter and I'm getting resumes, where can I store external users' resumes? You want me to put those on a hard drive or on a file share? No. Those should actually be stored where the group has access to them, but we need the right policies enforced. So absolutely, you need a strategy around classifying your data. And that goes right along with your security policies so that you can enforce these things. So those who are saying, hey, I don't know where to start, this is the slide for you. Okay. Group management day forward. First question, who can create them? Then we talk about naming conventions. We talk about external access from a guest perspective. You're talking about classifying the data. Well, there's probably some classification that relates to some level of extranet access. How can I have collaboration with people outside the organization? We don't want to enable that on the most sensitive data. And then we have things like expiration, attestation, being able to actually say, hey, is this membership correct? Is this group still in use? And there's the policies that get enforced based on classification, our ability to run DLP and e-discovery. There's so many of these features that are off by default. And I think that's one of the most important things for people to understand is just because these features exist doesn't mean that they're running and enforced. Microsoft doesn't know what kind of retention policies you need, and it doesn't want to be held liable for archiving data. So those things are turned off by default. Then you think about things like dynamic groups, which is a best practice. How do we build these attribute-based groups so we can leverage them and encourage the rest of the organization to leverage dynamic groups based on attributes? Like you're part of this part of the organization or you're an FTE, we have those flags, and so we can actually build the groups based on that. And we have auditing too, so thinking about the security aspect of that, reporting and analytics, what's being used, what's not being used, how often are we validating our membership, and so on. So quick list of things that you should be doing, building your policies around that. This is not absolutely prescriptive. This is basically giving you a checkbox that says, go look through this checklist and make sure you have plans across your hybrid strategy. Understand that a lot of these things are very, very difficult to enforce on-prem, but this is not just the cloud list. This is also your on-prem list. So we kind of talked about the strategy. Now we get into the planning and kind of defining those things. You need to plan, is it self-service? Is it IT? Either way, you need oversight. You need to think about the way that you're managing ownership. And even something where we say self-service, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody gets self-service. It might be that you actually have to watch a video or some training instruction so that you understand the policies. And in a lot of organizations, there's a clear checkbox that says, I agree that if I create a group, I will be responsible for managing the membership. And I agree that I am responsible for ensuring that an owner always exists and that kind of thing. So it's things, you don't want things to get out of control. So there's some level of ownership that's important, or stewardship as part of that. Now going back to that infographic, one of the sections on there talks about this ability when you look at managing groups in kind of a hybrid way. So on-premise, we have Exchange and Active Directory, and you have these groups. There's the security groups, the DLs, the Exchange, distribution groups. We have shared mailboxes, and we have Azure AD Connect, which connects those, which is where our members come from. So basically, the users get synced up into the cloud with Azure AD Connect. Now, we've actually got 3 main administrative interfaces for managing groups. And one of the things you'll notice across all 3, Microsoft 365 groups can be managed in all 3 locations. Now that might sound super confusing that you can manage Microsoft 365 groups in 3 different places, but there's actually different aspects to managing those groups in those different places. And you think about it, you don't want to have your Exchange guys leaving their world to then go somewhere else to manage your Microsoft 365 groups, in contrast to shared mailboxes and distribution groups or the email-enabled security groups. So there's some uniqueness to each of those environments, and we'll look at those in just a second. So as an example, when you go into Exchange Admin Center, you'll notice that from this interface, you can create groups. In fact, there's your groups in Outlook, which is your Microsoft 365 groups. There's some encouragement to upgrade your distribution lists. In fact, I'm a big fan if you start talking about how do we do cleanup? How do we reduce the footprint of groups? One of the first things I'm going to encourage you to do is look at how you're managing DLs. You don't necessarily need to have an on-prem strategy that's different from your cloud strategy. You need to figure out, you can have one place for managing distribution lists. There's very little that your admins need to do on-prem versus in the cloud. So that's one thing that can be simplified. Now, as well, in this interface, if you hit the drop down there, you can actually see from here, you can create an Office 365 group, you can create a DL, an email-enabled security group, or a dynamic distribution list. Basically, that's the attribute-based DL. So that's kind of interesting too. Now, if we go into Azure AD, you can see in Azure AD, when you go to click New Group, you can create a security group or an Office 365 group. So there's quite a bit less in here. And as well, you can kind of see there's an ability to add a description, adding owners and members. It's fairly simple interface. There's also the Microsoft 365 Admin Center as well, that basically gives us the ability to manage groups. And here you can click Add Group, and you'll notice in this interface we actually do have something. Notice the little sync status. So there is a nod toward the idea of our ability to say, are there any of these cloud groups that we do want to be able to sync and do write back? Now, I will be the first one to caution you about the write back. Essentially, these groups we're creating in the cloud, they look and behave in a very different way when they're in the cloud because they can't be used on-premise against on-premises resources. But when you start doing write back, there's a question about what are you trying to accomplish when you do write back, when you try and sync those on-prem. Now, I absolutely think that there's some important conversations to be had, and it's not something I can just flippantly answer in relation to synchronizing and doing kind of write back, but Microsoft has enabled some features recently around write back from a sync perspective, because everybody's been asking for that, but now they need to ask the question, why do you want to have that? So in relation to sync, and in relation to even management, think about it this way. You've got these AD groups. AD groups really are your global groups, your domain local groups, your universal groups. The difference is basically scope. AD groups also can have a SID or no SID. You know, as an example, if it's a security group, it has a SID. That ID, security ID, to be able to leverage it and use it for, say, securing a file share or some system, being able to basically enforce Windows security. So there's that, is it security enabled? Are you going to be leveraging it for ACLs, the access control list? Like when somebody logs in on their machine, it generates a list of what groups they're a member of, and essentially that login process is essentially used to determine what resources you have access to. Then there's the distribution groups. There's no SID. These can be dynamic, but essentially it's for distribution of email. So you do have an SMTP address. Those SMTP-based distribution groups can be upgraded into the Office 365 groups. And when they do, they can then also continue to be leveraged for mail, but now they can also be used for other things like SharePoint and Teams and tasks and notes and so on. And then we've got these shared mailboxes. Those are not synced, and they can be used for SMTP. They don't have ACLs or SIDs. They're just used primarily in Exchange as a shared mailbox, as a resource mailbox. And as well, when you're looking to simplify the world, I would say minimize the amount of shared mailboxes. And when someone asks for a shared mailbox, ask that question of, are you sure you can't do this with an Office 365 or Microsoft 365 group? Because in a lot of cases, they just don't understand that those new cloud groups absolutely fulfill everything that they need. There's very, very few cases. In fact, I'm still looking for good exceptions when you would need a shared mailbox over an Office 365 group. And especially when you're creating them in Exchange, if you're in Exchange or you're creating an Office 365 group, you can give them the name that you want, and you can control a lot of that SMTP aspect to it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these Microsoft 365 groups. I know that these are where a lot of people are living these days. I want you to be aware of some limitations. As an example, you can't nest groups. So while in all your on-prem situation, your groups can be nested, you cannot nest with Microsoft 365. Only users can be. They are public-private. It's required to have an owner, which is one of the reasons I really like these types of groups. It does have an email address, and one of the things as well is you can actually control, can it receive mail inside or outside the organization? So you can actually control whether it gets mail outside, as an example. These do not exist on premises by default, and like I was talking about, just that write back, there is the ability to do group membership write back, which you may be leveraging for other systems or some kind of process or whatever. So anyway, there's references there that you can use as well. A lot of applications in Microsoft 365 leverage these types of groups. Now going back to the Microsoft story, there's a couple of things I want to share that come from a presentation that was done at Ignite. where they shared some of their experience and best practices, essentially. So self-service group creation and lifecycle is absolutely something that Microsoft leverages as one of their aspects of empowering employees. But they also, where possible, they try and use dynamic groups. So essentially, if somebody is saying, hey, I want a group, they're going to encourage them to create a dynamic group if it can be. It's like, do all these people have the same manager? If the answer is yes, then you can actually absolutely create a dynamic group. Then it happens dynamically. They also say non-employees can't create groups. They all are also looking at blocked words. So when you go to create a group, there's a list of words, some sensitive HR type words that they're using to block them. Microsoft themselves doesn't use the prefix suffix. I think that's a usability thing for them. But there are absolutely other companies that they will actually put right in the group what it's used for, or departmental data, or company data. They'll stick those attributes right in the name of it. And I've seen that a few times too. So those best practices go different ways. Usage guidelines, such as be polite, be inclusive, basically saying don't create weird names for your groups, because then people aren't going to know what it is. And it's often support who's trying to determine, hey, there's no owner on this group. I don't know what this is. So how are we going to manage this? It might be some really important system that's managed with it, but since it doesn't have a friendly name, it's difficult. Life cycle. We'll talk a lot about life cycle a little bit later on, but essentially Microsoft leverages a 180-day policy where people attest membership. They're also looking for renewal. So if it's being used, it'll auto-renew, but if it's not being used, it'll be deleted and archived, essentially. And you can contact support and recover it, and so on. There's a custom job which will also handle any groups that don't have owners. And absolutely, this is one of the key ones when people start saying, hey, what are the low-hanging fruit? What are the things I should be doing? Any group that doesn't have an owner, you need to go after those now. I don't care whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. You need to go after those groups that don't have ownership. Now, we talked about classification. That's super important. Jobs, looking at the private and public, making sure that external membership basically is honored by the classification type. The group provisioning, making sure that it's in the right location. That's their multi-geo situation. They've also got the retention policies with the SharePoint side of it. The templates being applied. Essentially, there's a number of things template-based, both in Teams and in SharePoint, that you can use based on classification. And there's some additional things they're doing to enforce that there's at least one full-time employee on a group, and that groups have at least 2 owners. And I think that's pretty critical, and very, very important at Microsoft, because they don't want groups to get out of control. This membership review happens on a recurring basis, especially those with external members. All right, so let's talk about provisioning. And in provisioning, we talk about governance and lifecycle. I highly encourage metadata like having that secondary owner. We talked about Microsoft absolutely enforces there being a secondary owner, but also what about location? What about department? Is there other data we can put in there, even in the description of the group, that gives us additional context to what this group is? So if we ever lose an owner, or if it ever, IT is trying to understand what is this thing, that we're actually getting context. Now, this kind of goes along with that day forward, but when you start talking about provisioning, there's a lot of important questions around creation of groups. We talked a little bit about the naming conventions. There's some policies and settings, especially based on the compliance aspects of this. But should it be an email enabled? Do we want to allow external guests? What applications are going to be tied to this? Are there security considerations we need to think about? So there's a number of different aspects to hybrid, and if it's IT that's creating groups, they need to understand these policies, what should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. But absolutely, if you're doing self-service and you're trying to allow people to do this, you want to make sure you're asking the right questions, so you're creating the right type of group, but also when the group gets created, you're getting the right life cycle settings and things like that. The classification is being captured. Now, I want to be honest with you. I have noticed some of the best lifecycle features, especially as it relates to provisioning, things like naming standards and blocked words and some of the dynamic aspects to this. There's a number of things that do require Azure AD Premium, but as well, our ability to say these groups, you need to be a member of a group to be able to create a group. So basically being able to control who creates groups, guess what? That's an Azure P1 feature. So there's a number of these things that just because the feature does exist doesn't necessarily mean you have licenses for it. So that is something that you need to be aware of when you're trying to figure out your policies. What can you do? Do you have the right licensing to do it? But hopefully we've answered a number of those things up front so that when we go to set up those policies, you know what's possible. So we're looking here at the Azure AD examples, but you'll notice there's things like bulk operations, there's the audit logs, there's our expiration and naming policies as well inside of Azure AD. And a lot of those features are kind of cloud-based features, but very, very important around kind of the day forward. PowerShell. So you can use PowerShell to create groups and manage groups. There's a number of different PowerShell commandlets. There's those for Exchange. There's those for Azure AD. And notice that when we go new -Azure AD group, there's the -mail enabled. There's the -security enabled. So from a single command in PowerShell, we can actually add in what type of group it is. And notice there is as well the description. So you do want to put in a fairly rich description. And I'm noticing on this one as an example, where's all my owners? You know, I think it's very important that we do capture ownership as well when you're creating groups. So just be careful about that. Graph as well. So Mike Amerlin actually did a really cool session around using Graph. And there's a nice little screenshot from his session where he talks about leveraging the group IDs and the side IDs and the plan IDs and the lists. You know, we have the new Microsoft lists now. Man, it's so important that we actually get groups under control because there's going to be more and more of these objects we're trying to manage. And those groups, man, that's the top of the chain. So we want to make sure that we're doing a great job of managing our groups. And you can use, the way I like to think about it from a graph perspective is think about graph from the granular management perspective, where PowerShell is often looking at the entire service. But you can use the two together. You know, PowerShell is a scripting language. So even though you have those commandlets that help you do powerful things kind of service-wide, you can still use those to leverage using Graph as well inside of an individual group or service object. So the self-service, here's kind of a quick example of, here's a team site, but notice there's a new little drop down there, and I know that's very difficult to see. I'll just kind of point at it here. How sensitive is your data? That's off by default. That's something you can enable. There's actually a spot to be able to capture classification. I highly recommend that you do enable classification so that when you're creating these groups, and obviously we're looking at a team site, but your team sites can essentially be part of a group depending on the type of site you're creating. So it's interesting here around chicken and egg around group versus team. But you absolutely want to capture that classification and understand your owners. If you enforce double ownership, it'll enforce it right in the form. Auditing. Okay, auditing we are looking at some remediation around ownership and usage. So for example, right inside of Azure AD, you can manage owners, and you can see you got 2 owners. You can actually even add additional owners if you want right inside of Azure AD. We have our audit logs, so you want to look at ownership or membership. The other thing is you can actually export all your groups and have people periodically manage them. Here's the bulk operations where you can basically export your groups. As well, if you get some feedback and they're saying, hey, here's the members that can be deleted, you can actually use those bulk operations to remove membership as well, or even removing groups themselves. And don't forget about external groups, where essentially there's guests who are full-on Azure AD objects, and then you've got single file where it's external sharing, and you can enforce policies on how often those links to share a file. So you can actually say, hey, files shared outside the organization can only last for 30 days. So you can do expiration on links as well. So don't forget about those policies that relate to external management. And even from an Azure AD perspective, there's that B2C side of things where you can actually do kind of cool single sign-on aspects of leveraging Google, Facebook, or even Microsoft IDs around your external sharing. And one security thing I would talk about is that cloud app security. So your CAS policies, absolutely look at things like impossible travel, look at your, unusual file deletion. Somebody's deleting gigabytes of data. So the suspicious activity, these are features that are built right into Office 365, Microsoft 365. And if you know what those sensitive groups are, you can actually essentially kind of manage it from this perspective of looking at these and setting up policies based on the groups you really care about. And the last section here around archiving is the cleanup. We need to make sure we're archiving, deleting these obsolete groups, the groups that are orphaned. There is no owner. We got to be on top of that stuff. And essentially what that means is turning on expiration. Once you set a group to expire, you can actually do auto-renew. All owners of the group are notified if the group is not auto-renewed. Any group that's not renewed is deleted. And essentially, you've got 30 days to be able to recover a group right in the interface that can be done self-service by the administrator. So it makes it easy to recover. So don't be afraid to use these policies. And that is a Azure P1 kind of feature as well. So the little bit of lifecycle management, yes, you get your Teams renewal notice, the Outlook renewal notice. Depending on how the group is created, you'll see that in a couple different places. And you absolutely want to turn that on. You can enforce how many days it is. There's that BRK 2056 if you're looking for more on groups. That was a great session from Ignite that you can look at around expiration and auto renewal and a lot of those kind of cool features that just came to the product. As well, looking at the Azure portal for expiration, you can enable groups for expiration, so you can actually select groups or turning it on for all. So again, it could be policy based, right? And then we've got one last thing here around Microsoft IT. They leverage a 180-day group lifecycle, and then they use custom jobs to track down people with no owner or any groups that don't that have become orphaned. They want to clean up. You need to clean up all that stuff. If everybody leaves from the organization, it leaves it empty. When you think about group management, if this is identity and access management, there should be some group inside your organization who's focused on these things. They absolutely need to have those PowerShell scripts dialed in. They really need to understand the graph for being able to interrogate the groups and find those orphans or objects that are not being used. And there's a great opportunity as well for leveraging third-party tools. And I want to invite Bob in to talk about what Chaosoft is actually doing for group management.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Joel. Appreciate that.
Sure.
So, Joel, there's quite a bit you discussed, and I think every one of those points I think is relevant. But I wanted to start off explaining sort of where we fit from a bigger picture, not just Office 365 and Azure, but across the enterprise. So we've had a lot of experience in managing both Azure, Office 365, and our roots came from building management tools for the legacy Active Directory, on-premise Active Directory, I guess is a better way to call it, and on-premise Exchange. And so when we started the company, our number one design goal was to provide a management and automation tool that would allow you to perform a lot of the tasks you were just pointing out that Microsoft is helping with, but perform it across hybrid. So if you're in Active Directory today, you may just need Active Directory management. If you're going hybrid, you may need a mix, and then finally you may need just Office and Azure management at some point. But we're here to fill in the gaps for enterprises in particular, and providing an interface that is more enterprise focused rather than sort of a one-size-fits-all. No disparagement to Microsoft's user interface. It's a good user interface, but they're designing for everything from a 25 user company up to 1 million users, and so there's a lot there that can be maybe optimized if you're only talking about enterprise. So I mentioned we have management and automation, and we do this for users, groups, computers, anything on Active Directory on-premise, Exchange on-premise, and pretty much most things in Azure AD and Exchange Online. We're going into things like SharePoint and Office. We also provide a full Teams management. And if you haven't seen it, Joel did another webinar for us a while back on Microsoft Teams. If you go to chaosoft.com, /blog, you'll find a blog entry there about that Teams webinar, or you can go to chaosoft.com /resources. I think it's listed there as well. Anyway, we do Teams management, but I'm going to show you just a couple of real simple things that we do that really make a difference when you're talking about managing everything in hybrid or if you're in standalone management. So let's take automation first. Joel mentioned the Microsoft's dynamic groups. What a great idea to have groups that are based on rules, but wouldn't it also be great if you could do that not just for the cloud but also on-premise? Exchange had them on-premise, but Active Directory didn't, and so there are only a partial set of groups that would be covered there. So we've done that. We've done both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory and Office groups in one place, and we made them dynamic groups by applying rules to them. So for example, I may have a group, and Joel was talking about all employees. I'm going to scope that down a little bit. Maybe I only want to create membership, a membership rule for people who are in New York City, who are either in the accounting department or the finance department. So what I've done is I've pre-created what we call a Chaosoft dynamic group on premise. This is the Active Directory side. And effectively all I did is say new dynamic group. I picked the group, which is called New York Finance. Goofy name, I know. And then I created one simple rule to add in all people from New York who are in the accounting or finance. Maybe I should have the word department in here actually. Let's make that adjustment here, department. Users. Okay. So I decided that this particular membership rule is going to use a query to determine who can be put in there. And oh, by the way, there's another person named Jimmy I want to add in. Jimmy is in a completely different state. Maybe Jimmy's in operations, maybe a different city, different state, doesn't meet the criteria I'm going to put up here. So in this case, I'm going to use include that object for Jimmy. And you'll see we could also exclude people. So if you're trying to do segregation of duties or separation of duties, meaning anybody in finance or accounting could be in here, but oh, by the way, I want to exclude people that are in New York, they're in accounting or finance if they're part-time. I only want full-time people, for example. Or maybe I have a situation where I have like an IT role for people that can review audit logs I don't want the security folks in the security group to be able to clear the audit logs because the folks monitoring the audit logs could be fooled if they were security guys are out there doing stuff they shouldn't, they clear the event logs, right, or whatever. So I could use this include and exclude to include the auditors, but exclude people who are actually performing the day-to-day security tasks. That would give me a way to keep this group clean, for example. And then we can also exclude specific objects. So there are a bunch of people in here. One I don't like personally. I could exclude them if I wanted to. But I'm just going to do include object. I'm going to add. Gives me a little dialog box here. We'll say I'm looking for somebody named Jimmy. And we'll say Jimmy Buffett right there. So we'll go ahead and add Jimmy. He's going to be the odd person out. He's not in accounting, not in finance, and he's definitely not in New York. So how did I set up the query that would go out and do that? Well, it's a very simple thing. I just click add. It asks what type of objects do I want to put in this thing. You'll see I have a couple of different ones. We can also do members of other groups, or there's certain other types of queries that might be interesting, or I can pull in a text file. I can get people's managers, etc. Didn't quite get that fancy. I'm just going to click edit on the existing rule I did. You'll see I chose users from the default domain. It is multi-domain, multi-forest. And then I created this query. And I left this raw so that you could see it. If you've dealt at all with PowerShell, you'll immediately recognize this as a PowerShell filter. The entire product we have is built on .NET web services, such as Microsoft Graph or PowerShell. So very simple. If you already have some little bit of experience in PowerShell, you'll understand that filter. But we didn't want to make you have to count parentheses or really understand this, so we made it really simple for you. We actually built a little interface that lets you create these filters very easily. So in this case, it was not a simple one, because if I had just done department equal finance or department equals accounting, I'd get people from other cities, for example, potentially. So I also wanted to make sure that if they're in finance and accounting departments, they're only from New York. So here I use what we call a grouping. I kind of think of it more like an order of operation, right? Like you had in the old school math classes. I guess they still do it. Math hasn't changed that much. So department equals finance or accounting, and no matter which one the first one evaluates to, it has to be in New York City. Super simple. I'll cancel. Don't want to make changes here. Lots of other parameters and options here. I can preview just this rule. Oops, I want to save my changes here since I added Jimmy. I'll preview this rule, and if I'm looking down this list, you'll see that sure enough, New York Finance uses blah, 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 blah. If I sort and I come down to the J's, wherever they are, you'll see that Jimmy Buffett is not in here whatsoever. Just isn't in the list. That's because he wasn't in New York or part of finance, but we included him here. So the good news is that I can now preview the resultant membership with all the includes, excludes, queries. I can have as many of these things as I want. And now if I sort, I come on down here to the J's. You may have to just trust me. There's quite a bit in here. J.I., where's Jimmy? Where's Jimmy? There's Jimmy. So Jimmy is now officially in this group, even though he's in help desk for some other area. Now all of these are audited. We have a really great auditing solution. So this allows me to have a full chain of custody as this automation system is doing things. So I've told it to replace the description of the group in Active Directory with a note. I may also want to have some sort of threshold set up for adding and removing, so it only does so many at a certain time. And once this goes, I can also say, hey, add the details to the change history if I want full auditing capability. And I'll show you in a second where that shows up. I'm going to leave that off because it does slow it down a little bit. I'm going to simply make sure the saved changes were saved. I'm going to go ahead and execute this. And you'll see it finished already. It's already incorporated all those people into the group. So if I just simply jump out, and I think my group is in here somewhere. This is Active Directory Users Computers. There's New York Finance. I look at the membership. There's Jimmy Buffett. The other membership just hasn't caught up yet. It'll take a second. Oh, that's engineering. I'm sorry. I want finance. There we go. And it's caught up. You see it was still catching up a little bit because Active Directory is still writing those things. Let's say somebody maliciously comes in and just removes all those guys. I'll just delete them. Okay, Agnes is gone. She was the first user. If I schedule this to occur, it'll automatically repair that breach or that change. So I'll just run the rule again. I'll click OK. It already is done. You'll see the first time it ran, it executed very, very quickly, and now it's put all those people back. If I jump back to ADUC, we look at that again. My members, there's Agnes is back. So this is the power of these dynamic groups to tightly control. Now we do have some more rules that you'd find. You can make little additions. You can do subgroups and things like that, which you don't really get natively. But it gives you a very powerful place to manage your Active Directory groups. And if you notice, I also can do Office 365 groups here as well. So I can now have one place where I manage everything on-premise and in cloud. The great part about this, because a lot of people are synchronizing their groups from on-premise to cloud, I could just do this for on-premise groups, the ones I'm synchronizing, and I'd have those memberships where appropriate inside of Azure Active Directory or inside of Office. And we support all the group types, and we support Office 365 groups as they're related to Microsoft Teams. So you can actually use this tool to automatically put people into Teams and take them out. Even if they're Active Directory users, you can do this. It's pretty cool because we have those hybrid operations. So I wanted to point that out as complete automation. There are a lot of rules, individual automation rules that we have. I'm just going to show you here real quick. All the things that we deal with on groups, you'll see, here's just a list of all. You can think of these as, they're actually automation rules, very simple. You have a form you fill out to get them to work. But you could think of each one of these as replacing a PowerShell script, because I would say 90% of these are not done natively. So any kind of automation that you're interested in, we can do. We can look at a group and find people who are inactive in that group, meaning users who are inactive maybe need to be suspended. We have a whole non-destructive recycle bin process on-premise as well as in Office. So this doesn't help you if you just want to control users, right? So the other piece I'm going to show you is our web portal. And this is, I guess, what I would say is sort of like the Microsoft portal on steroids, right? Again, we're there filling in the gaps for enterprises. So the first thing you'll notice over on the left is I have dashboards, I have Active Directory. I come out and I do a quick search here. I already did it, it's cached, but I'll just do it again to show you. There I have a quick search of my Active Directory groups. If I need to work on Office 365, same portal. I just come in here and look at either the Office unified groups, or I can look at the Azure AD security groups and Exchange Online DLs, right? So in one portal, I have access to all my on-premise and my cloud groups simultaneously. And then I also have the ability to delegate these things down. So if I have some administrators who are just interested in a subset of groups, maybe only the groups that deal with a city, New York or Columbus, I can actually delegate just the groups needed so that they can manage only the groups that OU admin or that departmental or city-based admin is going to do. We take that even further. We do that also for Office. So for example, here in New York, you see I have quite a few things very similar to Active Directory, but maybe I have somebody who just helps engineering or maybe just helps the finance folks. Here you'll see I've suddenly mixed and matched we call these administrative units. Here I'm looking at engineering users. Here are Office 365 groups, guess what, that only deal with engineering. This is what would be called maybe a view in Office, or you'd have to create an admin unit which don't get exposed or can be delegated yet easily. And then of course teams as well. So if I just want them to work on teams that are assigned to the engineering group, I have that ability as well. So we have the ability to provide granular delegation at an enterprise level and with enterprise scalability so that you can tailor these things just to the users, the groups, computers, whatever you need for a specific set of administrators, maybe departmental level, maybe agency level if you're a state. We have quite a few U.S. states that are using our tool to delegate out management across these things. And I've mixed and matched. Here I'm looking at some AD stuff. Here I'm looking at some Office stuff, right? Pretty good. We also do provide unified self-service. That unified self-service gives us 80 groups that I own and gives me office groups that I may own. We also provide approval over those things. So if I look at requests, I can look here to see if I have any pending requests. Oh, these are my requests. I don't have any outstanding where I've made a request. But here you'll see I've been asked to certify a group. This gives me certification for keeping the group, extending the group, or certifying that the group membership is accurate on both Active Directory and in Office. And we do approval over membership both on in Active Directory on-premise, Exchange on-premise, and Office. And you'll see here I have that. Now, there's an awful lot going on this screen. So I just want to point out, when we delegate this out to an administrator, now I've just jumped over to a different person being logged in, you'll see that their views are much simpler. And they will also have self-service, but of course, if they're looking at their Active Directory groups or whatever, they'll have their own set of groups or Office groups in this particular case. And again, we also have the ability to delegate each task. So for example, when I'm a delegated administrator and I'm looking at, for example, just what I'm doing from self-service, I have, 5 or 6 things here. One of those allows me to quickly audit or view what people have done to the group. So I see I modified this group earlier. Pretty easy stuff. But I don't have very many commands here. When I'm delegated more permissions around group management, or if I'm just an Uber administrator, you'll see when I select, I have quite a few additional commands here, including suspend, group email, setting up membership restrictions, etc. So with membership restrictions and change approval, they're sort of the same thing. I can require change approval. In this case, the owners have to approve to join but not to leave. But I may also want to, on this Active Directory group or in an Office group, push further restrictions onto that group membership. And if I enable full restrictions, then I can set membership limits, which may be critical for synchronized groups, right? Because there are limits to the group members. And with Active Directory, I have quite a few options here. I can restrict it to users, groups, computers, or whatever. I don't want maybe contacts or computer, maybe computer objects are not allowed in this or groups, because those can't be nested, for example, or they can't exist in synchronized groups. So there's quite a few of these features that give you probably the broadest range of control over group management, especially when you're talking about a hybrid scenario of any solution on the market today. So full change auditing, full automation of group membership for on-premise or cloud, and then we do all those cool things to make sure that your security and compliance policies are sustained around groups, cleanup groups, memberships, expiries, all that good stuff. So hopefully that was within my 15 minutes. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to close up.
All right. I think we've got some questions.
Yeah, we do, and I know we're definitely running close on time. Thanks for those who sticking with us. Maybe we can just take a few that kind of, there's a few in here that look about the same. If you want, I'll just read them off. One
Sure.
is just simply, basically the question is, we have so many groups that have built up over the years. How do we even approach this thing? How do we even begin to approach cleanup?
Yeah, I'll start here, and Bob, I'm sure you've got some ideas too. But anybody who's feeling overwhelmed by groups, there's absolutely some low-hanging fruit. Try and identify those groups that have no membership, groups that have no ownership, and absolutely, once you turn on those lifecycle features in Microsoft 365, you'll start marching toward there being fewer groups. But a lot of it is trying to figure out what is your day forward strategy so you can actually do some lifecycle management around those groups. We have a lot more information about what groups are being used, like being able to do auditing, where in the past there really was no auditing features. You couldn't really tell what groups were being used. There's a lot more capabilities now, especially a lot of these richer lifecycle management style features. But even things like, if you approach it like you would approach unused mailboxes or unused DLs, sometimes it's one of those features where you've got to kind of like turn it off to know, and that may sound harsh, but a lot of the times is you want to kind of make some hypothesis around your groups and kind of march forward. But absolutely, those 5 things we talked about today, absolutely recommend really approaching it that way, of coming up with your strategy around classification, sensitivity, from end to end, all the lifecycle features.
Yeah, I have a quick comment on there as well. Hey, one of the other things that we see is that when people first start to move to Office, they sync those groups from on-premise to cloud. There's nothing saying you have to sync all of those groups. So one of the things you can do is you can use the filtering with Azure AD Connect to limit the groups just to the ones that you want to bring forward. Whether that's based on the name, the description, the location, we take that a little bit further to allow you to have a flag on those accounts. But certainly that is one of the ways to prevent all those old, maybe unloved groups from showing up in your cloud environment where you then still have to deal with them. So keep that in mind. It's a great way to reduce the number of groups that you have to then go and finish in the cloud. If you're making the full transition, sync the ones you want. If you're going to turn off on-premise Active Directory in a year or two, then you just really have to concentrate on those to make sure there isn't going to be something to damage those. One other quick comment, you can also in in Active Directory, if you're unsure if a group is used, there's something we call the scream method to test a group. And what it means is that you change the group type from a security group to a distribution type. I'm not saying go to Exchange and do this. I'm saying do this directly in Active Directory on the group's property page. And when it goes from a security to distribution type, the SID of the group is no longer put into the user's token. And so if they try to access some resource like a share or something along those lines, it'll actually not allow them to, because that they don't show the group memberships. And the reason we call it the screen method is because then typically somebody calls the help desk and says, I can't access something. So I'm not sure I would do that if I was sure that there maybe was some executive management going to be affected by that. That might be a career limiting move, but certainly that's a good way to test groups that maybe you just have no clue where to start with. Maybe the last resort. One other last thing I'll mention is that in Chaosoft, if you go to chaosoft.com/free tools, which is listed here on the slide, we do have a set of reports that will help you do group cleanup. And so, I don't know, there's probably a dozen or so free reports that are based on those things. No members, no owners. Those are all reports that we have out of the box. You can just install the tool, aim it at your domain, aim it at your tenant, and those reports are yours for as long as you want to use them.
Great. I know we're way over on time. Guys, there's some themes here. One is just generally like, hey, we're hybrid. We're going to stay hybrid. Even though more and more things are moving to the cloud, everything's not. So managing groups in a true hybrid environment, best tips for that. And then what can we expect from Microsoft to help here?
I'll go first here too. I do think that Microsoft's, future, they're very focused on these Microsoft 365 groups. The on-prem security groups, while there's a lot of support for it and will continue to be support for it, I absolutely think that how do we really understand what needs to be managed in the cloud and can be, and then minimizing groups that don't necessarily need to exist in a significant way. Like we talked about those group mailboxes or even DLs. If your Exchange is already in the cloud, there's things you can do to minimize what you have to manage on-prem. And then even on-prem, being able to kind of get a handle on what's being done on-prem and try and use those dynamic groups for as much of that as you can. So basically trying to minimize the footprint on-prem, doing more of your self-service type work with what's in the cloud, and then using those lifecycle features to manage it. I think it's one way to kind of get your arms around this.
Yeah, that's great. One comment I'll make, and I will qualify this. This is not a free component of our product, but we have in 2020 added the ability to synchronize an on-premise Active Directory group with an Office 365 unified group. Effectively, what we do is like a dynamic group. We resolve the membership for hybrid users and then push those hybrid users that we find, actually have accounts on the Office side into that group. So just a heads up, I don't believe yet anything from Microsoft that does that. It's a pretty common request. I know the user voice had it. We actually have implemented that. So if you want more information about that, you can either send chaosoft.com/question, or if you want to actually see that in action, you can request a demo at demo, or if you just want to try it yourself, feel free to hit download.
Okay. I think that with that, given the time, what we'll do is we'll take a look at these. Either Chaosoft or Joel or both of us will blog. Make sure we address the other questions that are in the question queue.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to blog about them if you want to send me the rest of them.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you all for attending. Thanks for your time today. We appreciate it. And thank you, Joel.
Thanks a lot.